Cool. Okay, so Python is considered by most to be a scripting language, although it is object-oriented. Python is more procedural than class-based, right? So I can write a Python file, and I can put whatever I want in that file, as long as it's Python. I can put multiple classes. I can put functions that aren't inside of classes. I can put classes that do nothing. I can have raw Python code, right? So that's one of the and some people get confused by that. Is this more free-form type style of coding, right? So in traditional Java, I created a demo file. Inside of demo, there has to be a class called demo. That's not the case in Python. So what I can do is I can come in here and I can say, I can import my modules. And so Python works on the same principle kind of that Java does, in that we can import modules or we can import individual parts of a module. Generally speaking, when we refer to modules, we're talking about files, right? So if I were to create, let's do this. Let's create another file and call it functions. So inside of demo, say I want to, let's create a function here. So I can import the module itself. I can say import functions, but to call anything using that syntax, I have to call any methods inside or anything inside of functions, right? So instead of being able to say foo, can't do that. I get an import error. I have to say, okay, which module from, I can't talk today, which method, class, or variable from foo am I calling here? So if I say functions.foo, then I can import it, I can run it, and the method will get called. Now, that's one way of importing in Python. So a lot of times what you'll see is like import OS. What's another one? Requests is another library or another module, right? And sometimes in Python, what you'll see this like request. Request is a library, but inside of that library, there's a main file that's being imported, and then you're able to say, okay, requests. If I can type requests dot get, and what that will do is we're pulling a get method. We're pulling that get function from somewhere inside of that library. And I'll get into how the libraries are structured in a second. Let's see if we go into this get method, you can see it doesn't live in a file called requests. It lives in a file called API. But inside of this egg file, and I'll get into egg files in a second, there is a Python package called requests, and inside of that is a file called API. So a lot of this stuff is usually specified, and I don't want to get too into the weeds at importing because you guys have all seen this before to an extent. Importing, it's really not that difficult. Very rarely will you have to write import statements like this. And this right here is what I was getting at when I was saying that just because we're importing a Python package doesn't mean that method is coming from a file called that name, right? So what's happening in here is we're basically pulling out these methods, which are then pulling them back to the main import statement, right? So that's, and you can, I mean, you could set all this stuff up if you want. It's a lot easier to just not deal with it. I've written Python professionally for 5 years, and I've never had to do anything like this. Just never come up. I've written libraries before and never had to do it like this. Some people do it like this, but you don't have to. So, like I said, that's one way to do it. Another way to do imports, and I'm just working my way down the file here as we build it out. Another way to do imports is to say, all right, from this module, give me this function, this variable, or this class, and I can say something like, so if I go into, let's go ahead and create another Python file here. We'll say class var class. So now I can say from classes import bar. So now instead of having to say, all right, instead of doing just import classes and then you instantiate a bar object, I have to say classes.bar. I can just come down here and say b is equal to bar. So still compiles, still works, pretty easy. When we get into Django, you'll see a little bit more confusion around imports, but I'll talk about that when we get there. For the most part, Django is able to identify, okay, if I pull from this sub app in my Django app, it knows where to find it and how to pull my functions back. So pretty self-explanatory, but we'll get there soon enough. Now, as far as variable declaration goes in Python, so Python is basically a typeless language, right? I can do a few things here, right? Let me see. I'll say JSON. So I can create a couple variables. So if I say A, I can say this is a string, and you notice I don't have to specify a type. The other thing to keep in mind in Python, since we're talking about strings for right now, so Python will take, there's a lot of different ways to create a string in Python, right? So the first way is what I just said, single ticks or single quotes. You can double quote and do the same thing. You can also do 3 quotes to do a multi-line string. So what I can do is I can say, oh, that's not what I wanted. Right, so if I go in here, if I come in here, well, I'll circle back to that. So I can create with single quotes, with double quotes, with 3 quotes to make a multi-line string. The multi-line, we use that more for like formatting JSON or HTML. What was that? If I remember correctly, it should. Yeah. Yeah, so, because keep in mind, right, so when we do the enters like that, we're just plugging in a hidden carriage return into that string. And there's actually, I think there's a setting in the IDE that I could turn on to show me, so on that multi-line string, where the carriage returns are. But, so we can also, so we don't have a specified type. We can also do this with, if we get into ints, same thing. There's not a lot of. You can just say, okay, d equals 324. You can also make a float by doing, something like that. I'm trying to think what else is there. You could also hypothetically make a float. So I can say we'll say f for float is equal to float, and we'll say 3.14. And so what we're doing, what we did on line 18 is basically a cast, right? So in Java, we specify the type in parentheses to do a cast. In Python, for the most part, to cast to another type, and really the only time that I've ever had to deal with casting is when dealing with ints to floats, right? And a good example of this is, let's say we do, let's say print. What's a good example of this? We'll say got to do some math in my head here. Let's say 12.25 times 4 is 49. So we'll say 49 as an int divided by 12.25. So if I run that, why didn't you show up here? Huh, that's weird. So that actually, that's weird, that worked. Usually when you get into like smaller decimal places, right, so like 4.0, but when you get into something that's a lot smaller, if you don't cast both the numbers to float, what ends up happening is you get converted back to an int, which rounds off. So if you end up with an, well, better yet, let's invert this, right? So let's say 12 divided by, let's say 12.25 divided by 49, and see where that puts us. Okay, so we end up with 0. Even though there's a trailing decimal, because we didn't cast explicitly to float, we end up with a 0. So, whereas if I come in here and I do float, so now we end up with a floating point decimal. So, I guess, and it's been a while since I've had to do revision in Python. If you're dealing, I still would have cast that int to float if I was writing code. But if you know if you know there's going to be a decimal, or there's always going to be a decimal involved with the expression, it will automatically cast to the decimal. But I would just cast to float just to be safe. So, I'm trying to think. So what else do we need to cover here? So that's casting. There's built-in types in Python. There's float, int, string, char, different other low-level types like that you can cast to. Obviously, there's references online. I'm not going to go into all of that detail. I mean, you guys are all seniors, so you should all know some basic programming language types. Couple things that throw people off, at least in my opinion, when it comes to working with Python for the first time and data typing is dictionaries, lists, sets, and tuples. So, you guys all know what a dictionary is, right? So a dictionary in Python or Ruby is a hash map in Java, basically. I think it's implemented a lot differently in Python than it is in Java, but so much easier to use, right? So if I say dictionary equals curly braces, open and close, and then I can say either single, double quote. I can pass in, all the indexes do have to be strings, but the values can be whatever the hell I want the value to be, right? I can pass in objects, JSON objects, strings, ints, chars, etc. So I can say A colon, and then is 1, 2, 3, B is equal to ST. And that's the other thing, right? So in Python, hypothetically, I don't have to have the same, I don't have to conform to a standard with my dictionary, right? So think about Java hash map in that if I were to create this dictionary in Java, I would have to say hash map string dictionary equals new, yada, yada, yada. In Python, I don't have to do that. In Python, I can give it a string key and then put an int at key A, a string at key B, and an object at string key C. So I can mix my types. Same thing with, I believe it works the same with lists, right? But let's print this real quick, this dictionary. Dictionary print for kb in dictionary.iter. And I believe it works the same way and I'll get into this iter items thing in a second. I believe it works the same way in, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay, I wasn't sure. Yeah. Like I said, I'll get into that in a second. I'll go over generators and stuff too. List comprehension and dictionary comprehension tools. But, so it works the same way with Python lists, right? So a Python list is an array. A lot of people get confused, the list to array. Python list is an array, is what we would consider an array in any other language. The difference being, same thing with the dictionary. I don't have to have the same type in a list. At least I don't believe I do. So if I say list, well, I shouldn't do that. If I say lst equals braces 1, A, 2, B, and I run that, it'll still run. And so if I say print, I say for item in lst, print item, and I run it, it'll print all of my content. Now, that to be said, is it good practice to mix types in a list? Not exactly. The reason I say that, right, so if you're doing a list comprehension in Python, so kind of like what I just did, I did a for loop. Would it make sense to have a mixed type if I was iterating over a list, assuming the same type, right? So say I'm iterating over a list of ints, and I'm doing some mathematical expression on it. No, it would be stupid to mix types. You do see mixing of types a lot more in dictionaries, and the reason being, so because Python is used in web a lot, we use JSON all the time in Python. So JSON can be can be of mixed types. So I can have, string objects and int objects and serialized objects of a class, I think. Anyway, so dictionaries, it's a little bit more commonplace. Yes. That's JSON. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, what was that? Yeah, so the syntax for a nested dictionary is super easy. Personally, I like to break down my variable declaration into a couple different lines to make it easier to read. Right, so when I actually initialize my multi-level dictionary, it's just easier to read. So if I come in here and I do this, well, I'll say C equals, and then you just nest the brackets. So now C is C is an object, C is a dictionary. So now I can say, okay, E, 1, 2, 3, F, 4, 5, 6, G, it's another dictionary. But see how it's a little bit easier to read being multi-line like that? Now what's the problem with what I've written below this to have, I mean it'll still work, but hypothetically, I wasn't expecting a dictionary in my for loop iteration. So now, maybe I have some logic in there. Well, now the logic breaks. Now, granted, we'll see that in JSON a lot. So, because obviously JSON, I mean, it's raw data stored as a dictionary. So you'll see 10 levels of dictionary nesting. Huge pain to work with, but it does happen. You get used to it after a while. If you know how to work with it, it's pretty easy. Especially if you don't really have to care too much about the keys, right? Or if you're just looking for one key. So that's dictionaries. Like I said, lists are pretty simple as well. Tuples are kind of like lists. You don't really have to worry too much about tuples. I don't really ever deal with tuples. There are people that deal with tuples. There's people that like them. I don't like them. If I remember correctly, and this is how little I use them, I actually don't remember what the difference between a list and a tuple is. So let's see, tuple. So that's right. So the biggest difference between a list and a tuple. So a list, I can go through and I can actually delete items out of a list. I can add and I can delete, right? So I can come in here and I can say delete lst at index -1. Another cool thing about Python, I can reverse traverse lists, right? So if I go all the way down to index 0 in this list is 1. But if I do -1, basically the negative indicates give me the length or the size of the list, so the number of items in the list, minus whatever the negative index is. So delete list -1 will delete the last item in the list. -2 will delete the second to last item in the list. -3, so on and so forth. So if we run that, on the first run, we'll print, 1A to B. On the second run, we'll print 1A to. The difference between a Python list and a tuple is that lists are mutable, meaning I can delete them, I can add to them, I can edit the information inside of them. That was weird. Whereas a tuple, I can't. When I create a tuple, that tuple is there until the code stops running. Which is why I personally don't like tuples. So, what's the point of having a really cool and dynamic language if you can't be cool and dynamic? So that's adding to a list. That's deleting from a list. So we'll say, I should probably start adding some comments in here. Delete from list. The other thing, so unlike Java, Python comments are hashtags basically. So $, it's like a shell script, right? So $, comment out a line of code. We can also do multi-line comments in Python, and I'll get back to what I was doing in a second, with 3 single ticks to open and 3 single ticks to close. So, I actually think you can do it with the standard quotes too. So either one works. Python's kind of like the honey badger. It doesn't really, care about the quotation marks. It sees a quote, knows it's a quote, rolls with it. So that's Python comments. There's not really like a Python documentation like standard like there is in Java, right? So I've seen Python documentation in a million different forms. Generally speaking, and I'm gonna get back to the list thing here in a second. Generally speaking, so you'll comment when you do like a function, like a method comment. You'll do that comment inside of. Usually that works. Let me see. Really? really. So generally speaking, the syntax for like commenting inside of a method would be, or commenting a method, a function, would be 3 ticks, open and close multi-line, inside of the method body. So right underneath the declaration is where you would put your comments. Same thing with a class, right? So inside of the class, I would do it right underneath the class declaration inside of the class body. Just say this class does nothing. Variable declarations, just Java style is fine, just above. Generally is the way to go with that. If we go back to lists, so we know how to delete from a list, but what if I want to add to a list? Well, to add a new item to a list, what I would want to do is I would want to say lst.append and then add in the new item. Now, what if I want to update the value inside of a list in Python? Again, super easy. I say the name of my list, and then I just index it and say equals foo. That's good. lst.append. I see what I did. Yeah, so pretty easy. When we're dealing with dictionaries, we don't have a way, because the dictionary's key value pair, we can't just append. So the best way to add to a dictionary is going to be to just say the name of the dictionary and then index it like an array but with the key. So obviously you guys know in Java that we can't just use this syntax, this bracket syntax, to pull data out of a hash bound. In Python, I can just use bracket index like I do with arrays, with primitive arrays, and I can say so A is equal to, or I'm sorry, I can get the value stored at A, value A equal to, so I can pull out the value like that, or I can add a new value, so I can say dictionary D is equal to 1, 2, 3. Makes sense. I know this is probably super exciting for you guys just to do like variable declarations and stuff. So another really cool thing that we can do in, yes? Yes. So what we can do to, and that's the thing, right? So Python, generally speaking, you just say for, they use mostly for each loops. There's not really a standard for loop, like a for with a counter like there is in C-based languages, but we can forgo that, or we can work around that by saying for I in range 0 len, and len is a built-in method for giving me the length of a string. A list doesn't work on dictionaries or a tuple. So what I can do is I can say for I in range, and I being my index in a traditional Java loop, I say len of lst. So now I can say at index we have stored lst at I. And what the range method does, the range method is another built-in Python method. Basically, we give it a start value and a stop value, and it iterates by default one full integer at a time from the start to the finish. We can also reverse that. We can change the step. We can say jump by 3s, jump by, not necessarily, well, I guess we could jump by like a Fibonacci sequence too if we really wanted to. But, yeah. What was that? Oh, yeah, you can do that. That's the thing. There's a million ways to skin cats in Python, right? I tend to go, if I care about the index, I generally just use range, just because I think it's prettier to read. I could be wrong, but we can give that a. I have never seen it like that, but you know what? Yeah. I could. I still think it takes 2 arguments, but I could be wrong. So run it. Okay, so you don't have to specify the 0, but exactly. If I wanted to start, say, halfway, say I was doing merge sort in Python, right, or binary sort. So say you guys have done. Wait, they got rid of the data structures and algorithms class here, didn't they? So you guys have never seen merge sort, binary sort, red-black trees, ADL trees, graphs. Okay. You guys have seen bubble sort, right? Okay. Cool. Believe it or not, I have actually written like merge sort functions before for things in Python. When dealing with really massive sets of data, right? So I can sort data, like there's a list sort in Python. I can sort data automatically in Python. It's not that effective. So when you're sorting like 20 million records of CSV files, like when you're dealing with CSV files that are like 900 megs, you start thinking about how can I optimize this. So I have written merge sort and binary sort functions for Python for dealing with large sets of data. So when you start getting into those kind of functions, that's where you would want to specify a starting index and an ending index, right? Because in merge sort, we take the first half and the second half. So you can do it, but always better practice to know both ways. So that is neat, though. I've always assumed you had to do the 0. Anyway, so while we're on the topic of for loops, you guys know about list comprehension in Python, right? Yes, no, maybe, kind of, meh. All right, so list comprehension is really kick-ass. There's not a lot. I can't think of a really good example of when to use this, but because you can't print with it, right? So say, okay, I've got the example here. Let's say I have a list of numbers. 1, 3, 5, 7. What are some primes? Let's see if you guys remember. What are the first few digits in the Fibonacci sequence? So 1, 3, 5, 7. Is it? Well, no, hang on. That doesn't look right to me. That's right, yeah. I started to say primes and I thought Fibonacci. Because well, I've never seen a Fibonacci list that started with 0. So let's say 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and we'll stop at 21. All right, so list comprehension in Python is super cool in that if I want to update the contents of an entire list, or I want to go through and validate, like, if I want to say I want to update a variable inside a list, right? So say if one of these numbers is prime, which all of them are except for 2, 8, and 21. Actually, 2 is not a prime, is it? 2's not a prime number, is it? Anyway, let's make it even easier. Let's say all of the odd numbers I want to add 1 to make them even. All of the even numbers I want to subtract 1 to make them odd. So what I can do with the list comprehension is, instead of writing this big nasty for loop, I can literally do this in one line. So I can write really concise and maybe not understandable for certain people, but a really small code that can run on a really small box like a Raspberry Pi, right? So I can hypothetically cut down the size of my code by like 100% or 50% by not doing loops. Obviously, you still want to do some loops. But what I can say is I could start a list comprehension, and I could say nums is equal to itself, and I can say I for I in, let's say do for I in actually, no, we should be able to do it like this. So I plus 1 for I in nums if I. So I want to add 1 to all the evens. So what I can do is I'm saying, so for each I in nums, the new value is equal to I plus 1 if I mod 2 is equal to 0. Meaning that it's an even number. Else, I minus 1. No, it's not. Oh, I know what it is. Okay, so that'll work. But so really, this is one of the times that you get kind of crippled by the list comprehension. I could say else I, right? Anyway, generally speaking, oh, friggin' A, that'd be a ternary. So what we could do is we can go through and, with this list comprehension, we can go through and add 1 to all of the even values in the list. However, if we wanted to get into something where we would add 1 to the evens and subtract 1 from the odds, we would have to write a Python ternary. And a Python ternary is structured a little bit differently than a Java ternary. But before I get into that, does everybody understand the basic syntax here for list comprehension? So basically, in place, I'm iterating over the list and doing something with the value. And I can call this variable whatever I want to. It's only scoped to that list comprehension. Obviously, I can't call it like dictionary, because that is it's overshadowed by a variable in the script. But at the inside of it, I can call it whatever I want. And that's the thing. So Python doesn't really have a ternary like Java does, right? So in a language like Java, I could say A is equal to, and I can't even remember the syntax. It's like 2 greater than 4 or 2 greater than 5, question mark, 5 colon 6, something like that. So Python's ternary is a little bit, I don't know, to me it makes more sense. But what I can do to do a ternary is I can say, instead of saying I can say I and then if, or I'm sorry, I plus 1 if I mod 2 is equal to 0, else I minus 1. So now I have list comprehension with a ternary to flip the odd to even of all my numbers in my list, right? So if I come in here and I go ahead and print this, so I'll say for num and nums, print num. Okay, so in my first run, I have wait a minute, something screwed up here. Let's do this. Let's say print, because I'm a little confused here. That's weird. Huh. Oh, I see what I did. Okay. Okay, so you can see on the first run, we printed out the first few numbers of the Fibonacci sequence. On the second run, we printed out 0, 0, 3, 2, 4, 9, 12, and 21. We flipped all the numbers from odd to even. So using that ternary, so you can think of this part right here as the assignment in the list comprehension. Then this part right here is the ternary saying, all right, this is the value if this is true. Otherwise, this is the value. And then I say for I in numbers. Very similar to the for loop at that point. So, makes sense? Kind of. A lot of confusion there. Not the easiest thing in the world to read. But we can simplify this down even further, right? So this is where we can start getting into functions. So we talked about imports and we created a function called functions.py. Now, one method for flipping the signs on our Fibonacci sequence is going to be, instead of doing that ugly ternary, why don't we just write a function for it? So we'll say def. So all Python functions start with def. So, or basically it's short for define, but we say def flip odds, evens, and then just like a Java method, we just specify, kind of like a Java method, we just specify the arguments. Again, we don't have to specify the types, we just say the argument. We can also stub out a method, and unlike in Java, because we're not specifying a return type and we're not specifying an argument type, I can just say pass, and what that does is that has stubbed in my method. Because when the Python runs, because Python is an interpreted language versus compiled, although I've gotten into arguments about this before, Python does both, depending upon the situation. When you're dealing with web frameworks, Python will be compiled because it's faster to run Python compiled code, also known as PYC files. But otherwise, like in the context of my IDE, it's going to interpret it. So hypothetically, I could put some really wonky stuff in functions.py. It would run, but then it would just error out during the run. Versus Java, where if I screwed something up in Java, it wouldn't run. But back to our function here. So I can stub it out, but I don't really want to stub it out here. Instead, I want to do my logic, and I'll say if num mod 2 is equal to 0, return and actually I don't even have to do that. Do you guys know about pass by reference versus pass by copy? Yes, no, maybe so. Okay, so for those of you guys that don't know, pass by copy is a form of well, basically they're both forms of passing arguments to functions or values to constructors. Pass by copy means that when we call flip odds, evens, and pass it a number, we basically make a copy of that in memory and pass that copy of that original variable into that function, and then that copy only has a lifespan while it's running in that function. Whereas pass by reference, I pass in whatever variable I pass in actually goes into that function. I can modify that variable, and without returning anything, that variable is changed. Does that make sense? When you get into languages like C and C++, you actually have to specify, okay, this is going to be passed by reference versus this is going to be passed by copy. In languages like Java and Python, it's just implied, right? So Python is passed by reference. I believe Java is passed by reference as well, right? I'm almost positive Java is passed by reference. But because of that, so in this flip odds evens method, or I'm sorry, function, if it was pass by copy, we would have to return a value. But because it's not a pass by copy language, all I need to do is I can say, all right, if it's an even number, I can say num equals, I can say num is equal to itself plus 1. Otherwise, num is equal to itself minus 1. So, like I said, because we don't have to specify a return type or anything like that in Python, if I wanted to return something, I could return something. If I wanted to, if I can talk today, if I wanted to not return something, I don't have to. It's really up to me at the time that I write it. That to be said, it does make it a little confusing sometimes when you get into really big functions where we look at the top, we don't know what it's going to return, and especially when you get into like passing by reference versus passing by copy, gets a little confusing. So if we go back to our demo and we come back to our list comprehension, we can get rid of completely this ternary statement and just say, well, we need to import it first. So we could say functions dot flip odds evens I for I in nums, and basically we're flipping the what's the word I'm looking for here? Basically, we're doing our flip, and we're passing in a variable. That variable is passed by reference. Therefore, I'm not returning anything. I'm just modifying the variable. Right? So if I run this, oh, that's right. Okay, so slight correction on what I just said. Python is passed by reference except with primitive types. So when we pass in, well, no, hang on, wait a minute here. Let me just. Oh no, I was wrong. It's confused myself here with this list comprehension. Does anybody see why we got nuns back? Does anybody have any idea why that happened? I know why it happened. I just want to see if you guys caught it. Okay, so what's happening in our list comprehension? It's not returning a value, but this I, what is that I scoped to? Yeah, just the list comprehension. So if I was calling flip odds evens with the index of the list, that would work. But because I'm using a temporary variable that's scoped only to my list comprehension, because my do flip odds evens doesn't return a value, in Python, instead of, I mean, you kind of still have a null pointer, but in Python, if you try to assign a value to a variable from a function that has no return, you just end up with, oh shit, I thought that was at 3:30. You just end up with none, which is why we're getting none in our list. But if I get rid of that comprehension entirely, and I say functions dot flip odds evens num, and I run it, why didn't that work? That's weird. Huh. Oh, that should work. Maybe I was right, I think. Okay, I think I was kind of right. Sorry, it's been a long time since I've done the pass by reference versus pass by copy. I was right. Python does do pass by copy when you're dealing with primitives. When you're dealing with objects, then you get pass by reference. Does that make sense? So it's kind of this weird conditional thing where if it's a raw number, okay, if it's a raw number, it's going to be passed by copy. Whereas if it's an object or a string, it's going to be passed by reference. So, what's the last thing we got to cover here? So, does that make sense to everybody though? I know that was a really bad way to explain it. I apologize if I confused you guys, but does that make sense? Pass by reference, pass by copy, function arguments and stuff like that. And again, I mean, this is really basic stuff, right? So we can get into, I mean, we can return multiple variables from Python. We can get into args. We can get into keyword arguments. None of those things I want to go over today, because that's where you start getting into more advanced topics in Python, and we will do that in Django. But for an overview here, let's keep it simple. So one thing, I just got to cancel this 3 o'clock. So the last thing I want to cover today is I want to cover classes. So you guys have worked with classes before, probably for the last 3 or 4 years. Python classes, they're not super hard. They can be complicated, they can be annoying, but they're pretty straightforward. So at the simplest level, right, Python classes are just like Java classes. They have member variables and they have member functions. Member variables are declared in a couple different ways. Well, one way really. What we do is we can say, well, there's a couple ways to do it. If I know the value, if the value is not going to change, I can say foo outside of any function inside of the class. I can say foo equals hello world. So let's say bar class. Or alternatively, and that's a member variable that I can access statically. Okay, so if I go into my demo and I say that I import class from classes import bar, so now down here I can just say print bar.foo, and it prints. Whereas the other way to do this, well, there's a third way. The other way to do this is to declare your attributes inside of the constructor. So to do a constructor in Python, it's a little bit different than in Java. In Python, instead of creating a function or specifying syntax, what we do is we say def double underscore init and pass in the self keyword as an argument. We have a constructor. So inside of that, I can say self dot var1 equals hello, self dot var2 equals abc, self dot var3 equals 69. So now I have 4 member variables of my class bar, but the difference here is that I can't access these other 3 without instantiating an object of type bar, right? If I go back to demo and I try to say print bar.var1, actually, and that may actually work. Yeah, so it failed. We got an attribute error. Class bar has no attribute var1. Well, it does, but it's not visible until we instantiate it. So now, what I can do to access that is I can say b equals bar b.var1 print b.var1. Now we're able to access it. Now, the third and final way to do this, and I don't know why anyone would do this, but Python does have a concept of encapsulation and like private modifiers, but it's not a lot of people use it. I mean, you can. It's Pythonic to use it, but not a lot of people do. And that's just to put an underscore before your variable name inside of a class or inside of a file. And basically what that tells Python is that, hey, this is private. Don't let anybody that's not a member of this class access that variable. So if I go back to demo and I update this to use the underscore, it should fail me. It doesn't. But I've seen it. I don't remember the exact area that the underscore fails, but I have seen it fail before for unable to access because of the scoping issue. That to be said, generally speaking, you don't have to give it an underscore. Speaking of underscores, one thing to note is that in Java everything is camel case, Python everything is underscored, right? So just like flip odds evens in Java that would be Pascal case or camel case, Python it's just underscore after each one. Excuse me. Back to the classes. So that's member variables in a nutshell in Python. To access that member variable in Python in another function, or from another function inside of the class, we have to specify self. I can't just say var1. At least I don't think I can. So if I say def foo, and just like the constructor, we always have to specify self prior to our other arguments. So self, comma, a, that I can do print var1. Yeah, it doesn't work. So we have to specify self, otherwise Python doesn't know where var1 is coming from. So self.var1, Pretty self-explanatory from that perspective. Arguments are the same way in that, or the same way as in a plain function as there are in a class, and the only difference being specify self first. There is, however, a concept of static methods or static functions, just like there is a concept of static attributes of a class, right? So foo acted like a static attribute of the class, right? You guys remember static from Java. I can do the same thing in Python by saying def static foo. Instead of saying self, I say CLS print So instead of specifying self to make it static, we specify CLS. So now if I go back to my demo, I can say bar. I can just say bar dot static foo. Well, it choked. Bar is the first argument. That's weird. Huh. Maybe I'm remembering that wrong. Try to remember it. Okay, so I was wrong. So CLS is when we want to instantiate a bar object from within the bar class, right? So what we would use CLS for would be, if inside of classes, inside of static foo, I wanted to say, basically it refers to this class. What I could do is I could say instance equals CLS, and that would instantiate a bar object, so an object of the same type as the class we're executing in. There's not really a lot of times that you would use this. To make it static, I was a little mixed up. To make it static, I would use what's called a decorator. And a decorator is something that we'll get into later on. But basically what a decorator is it's a function that takes a function as an argument, right? So we decorate static foo, and because, and I can't remember if I said this earlier in class, Python can take functions and treat them like objects. So we can decorate a function and take the whole static foo function and pass it into the static method class, or I guess it's static method decorator, and get a static method out of it. So now what I can, and like I said, I'll go into that later on because we will use decorators a lot in Django, and we will have to write our own decorators to do certain things in Django. But now I should be able to call static foo statically. Static foo takes exactly one argument. Hang on. That's right. I'm stupid. Okay. Get rid of the self. So that's the other thing. If it's a static class function, get rid of the self. So, makes sense? Did I miss anything on classes? That's the other thing. So no arguments come up here. It's not like a method declaration. No braces. We can literally pass in our constructor parameters down here, and I can just say v x, y, pretty easy. Any questions about Python? No. Like I said, obviously there's a ton of information about it. If you guys get lost or confused, email me if you have questions. As long as we're not too into the weeds, I should know it off the top of my head. Other than that, we will see you guys Thursday and start going over Django. So, Thursday we will have to go over Python environments, though. That's the one thing I didn't get to cover today. So virtual environments and requirements generate handling and things like that. So, yes and no. What's up?
Yeah, just
Sorry, you can let me
Yeah.
move some of this crap out of the way.
yeah. I think I just need another one because I'm trying to set up like MySQL on the Windows because I don't have much experience with Windows, but MySQL just looks like like I'm wondering if I just install like the ROM version or something like that. Yeah, because I don't know how to like connect it to MySQL to my like actual project.
Okay, did you create, like, install the MySQL server and create the tables and all of that?
No, not yet. Not
Okay.
that far.
So this actually looks pretty fine, right?
Yeah.
So let me show you.
Yeah.
Like mine, there's a lot of different versions, right? So that's what this version looks like on that machine. I have a different version on this machine.
Okay.
So this actually looks fine, but basically what you would do is, and there's tabs up here, right? So to add a new connection, what you do is you come in here and hit the plus,
Okay.
and then you give it a name and point it to your host, which is the local host, 3306, pass in the username, and then what you would do is once you've added that and hit OK, that'll show up down here. And actually, what is it? That looks like you have something here.
Yeah, I think I have that. Something like that.
Okay, so there's the navigator. Oh, that's weird. Oh, maybe.
Yeah, I'm trying to see because you're showing us in the video there should be like some tables. Yeah.
Yeah, there should be. So that's the.
Well, maybe that's the wrong version because I'm installed like MySQL Workbench and also I have like connector.
So MySQL connector is like the connection. How do I put this? So MySQL connector is going to be like the library to actually connect to MySQL for Java.
Yeah, that's
Work-
what I want because
Workbench is going to be, so you're on 6.3 and I'm on, but it really shouldn't matter.
we're
I'm
on
on
a victory.
6.3 too. Wait, so serious question, why are you doing this on Windows versus Mac?
Oh, because I'm just kind of like I don't have more space.
Okay.
In the Mac.
Okay. No, I was just curious. Because this could be a Windows version thing too.
Yeah.
So, if we go back to this guy, so that should be right. So that's our query. So if I use show tables,
Oh, I didn't create any tables yet.
oh, you didn't create any tables yet. Maybe that's why nothing's there. Do you have any databases?
So where I can just find my database?
Well, let's do. Oh, shoot! This is Windows.
Yeah.
Oh my God! It's been so long since I've been on Windows. Username is root.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think the password would be
where did you install MySQL to? Oh shoot! That's been so long since I've been on Windows. Is it? What goes in C drive? Oh, it's program files 86.
yeah, it should be.
Good. That should be inside of.
Oh, right here.
CD my. Here. Why is the X2 one up here? Because that's there, but why doesn't it show up? What else? So, Well, here's one small problem that we're facing. Is we're getting that, but that's on a different one. So let's close this, open that. Okay, so is your MySQL server running? It says it's stopped.
Yeah, I don't know why.
You said you had an app?
Like,
SQL Workbench. SQL Brand Client. Okay. Plug in your root password for me
I think that's
on the for MySQL.
I don't remember. I just heard.
You didn't change it?
I think what's the default password you like? The password key.
So there's no default password in MySQL. It generates a password for you, at least on Linux. What it does is when you install it, it automatically generates a password for you.
I
It
think
outputs somewhere.
my password is the password active. Let's try that.
MySQL, Brand Client, PASSQL. Maybe. So something happened. But what happened? Okay, so that just died on me. MySQL Utilities Console?
I don't know what is that. Because when I install like my SQL Workbench, so all everything just come out.
Let me see. Oh, it's not called. It's a task manager is what I'm looking for. So let's just see if it's even running. Because if it's not running, that's probably the issue.
Oh, like the server or something?
Yeah. So like the service, right?
Okay.
So like on the Mac, right? So I have MySQL's community. I have the Workbench, which is an app that lets me connect to the server that's running in the background. As it appears, your server is not actually running on here, which is why, if we go back to the Workbench, why we're getting these issues. Like if we go to administrative status, and we're getting this stopped. Whereas if I go to like mine on my Mac, if I can remember the password. That's weird. That's not it. I'll do it on this one because it's easier. But you see, I've got a totally different version here than I do here.
Yeah.
But if I go to localhost, you can see, so now I've got this thing where it lists my schemas because it's actually able to connect to my local environment, my local MySQL server.
Okay.
Whereas I think yours, you're not getting that view because you're not able to connect to it. So I think if you fire up MySQL on here, you should be able to view kind of what I view.
Okay. So how do you know, like, you just create like a different tables or something? So how do you know it just connect to your project?
So it connects to the server, and basically there's what's known as concept of brand tables in MySQL, and basically depending upon the user I hit the server with, that dictates what I can see in the server itself. So like you can see, I can see 3 different schemas, 3 different database schemas.
Yeah.
Inside of those schemas are the tables. Now, if I had a different user that was only allowed to see IP 4045, I could only see that.
Okay.
I forget where I was going with that. Where was I going with that? What was your original question?
Oh, it's
Right,
like,
a second ago.
oh, I mean, how do you know? Because your project may be like in the different other names. How do you know, like, if you run this one, so it just like access the data from your project?
So what I would do when you go in and create your schema, I would just name your schema your 6+2.
Okay.
That's generally my recommendation, and I am going to put an announcement about that. So what you would do is you would name your schema. So you would come in here and you would say create data. I think it's create database, and that's my 6+2. So if I run that and I refresh, now I have a schema with my 6+2. So then inside of there, that's where I would put my tables. So you can see that when I look at it, I got the tables. whereas in this one I've got tables.
Okay.
So that's what I would name your schema. As far as the table creation, so pretty easy. So inside of what I can do is I can right click that and I can just say set as the default schema, and then I can just right click on tables and say create table, and then it's just like we did in class, right? So I add my
Yeah.
columns and then my modifiers,
Okay.
and then you just apply, and then you point your Java code to your MySQL.
Okay.
So like your Hibernate CFG files or Hibernate HBM files to do the mappings there.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
does that help any?
Yeah, I'm gonna just fix this one
Okay.
first. Yeah.
Yeah, I would go ahead. I would just try to get that running. So
Yeah.
get your server running and then try to connect to it. If you're still having issues, let me know and I can take a look.
Okay.
I can set up some we can set up some time Thursday after class too if you need it. So
Okay.
just let me know.